Hey everybody, NacreVMX here, and it's time for another look at the Nintendo consoles. Now today we're going to be taking a look at, of course, the Nintendo DS, as I mentioned. But just yesterday, as I was thinking of this, I realized that I forgot something. That when I talked about the, I didn't really know where to put it in, but I never talked about the Super Game Boy, and I wanted to talk about that. It's not really a console. And I didn't really know where to put it. Do I talk about it in the Game Boy video? Do I talk about it in the Super NES video? Basically, it's a cartridge that goes right into your Super NES, and then you can put Game Boy cartridges into it and play Game Boy games on your TV through your Super NES. It was a pretty cool idea, but there were some games that used special features that could only be used by the Super Game Boy, like certain frames and special colors and such, and you can see the little Super Game Boy logo on some games. Let's see if I have one. Oh, look, the first one I pulled out, the Page Master, which, it's funny, you can never find any information about this game at all. Most people have forgotten the ridiculous movie, but this is actually a surprisingly decent game. So if you can find it, it's probably at, fucking bottom of the barrel prices, but actually a pretty decent game with great controls. Kind of difficult, too. Pretty interesting. But anyway, you would just... Here, let me just show you. You would just... this is a different game, but... You would just pop the cartridge in there, and then just pop it into your Super NES. The only thing is you couldn't play multiplayer for whatever reason. I never understood why until much later. I realized that this is technically a Game Boy here, and that the way the Game Boy multiplayer works is you would need 2 Game Boys, and here you're having 1. So that's the way it works. So today, of course, we're going to talk about the Nintendo DS. Now... The Nintendo DS officially marked the end of the Game Boy line of handheld consoles that had prevailed for so long. The original Game Boy was such a huge success when it came out, and it outlasted everything. There were other consoles that came out around the same time, and handheld consoles, that is, and it outlasted all of them. There were other ones that came out later, and the one thing it's funny is that all the possible competitors to the Game Boy all had one thing in common. Through one way or another, they were all technically superior to the Game Boy. Although most of them were indeed 8-bit, just like the Game Boy. Think about the Game Boy as it had a dot matrix display and only 4 colors available. And they were all black, white, gray, and other gray. It was black and white. It was monochrome. And with the original Game Boy, the Brick Boy, it was yellowish, greenish, kind of pukey color. It wasn't even true black and white until the Game Boy Pocket came out. When you think about the Atari Lynx that came out, that had color displays. It had crappy graphics, but it had a color display. And it had some good games, just not a whole lot of them. The Game Gear, same thing. I mean, that had a light on it, and it looked really good. The Game Boy destroyed it. There were later consoles that came out, like the Turbo Express, where you could play TurboGrafx games handheld. It didn't even have its own games. You just play the TurboGrafx 16 games, pop them right on the Turbo Express, you're good to go. So that was a 16-bit handheld, up against an 8-bit handheld that was in black and white. And the Turbo Express had a TV tuner. There was the Game.com, there was the WonderSwan and WonderSwan Color in Japan, there was the Neo Geo Pocket. It outlasted them all. Then the Game Boy Pocket, the Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Advance SP, the Game Boy Micro, everything was Game Boy, Game Boy, Game Boy, Game Boy. There was the Super Game Boy, there was the Game Boy Printer, the Game Boy Camera, everything was Game Boy. And then when Nintendo reveals their next handheld console, they said it's called the DS. The DS is, of course, most known for its dual screens, and its design is interesting. It takes a little bit of something from every Nintendo handheld that had come before it. The obvious flip-up design, it kind of invokes the Game Boy Advance SP, but not only that, but it also kind of invokes the Game & Watch, and it's wide like the Game Boy Advance and Game Boy Micro. And it has a backlight, headphone jack, and everything, so let's take a look at my DS, huh? Okay, now this is the DS Lite model. There's actually 3 models of DSs. The original model DS, the DS Lite, and the DSi. I plan on eventually getting a DSi, but it's not going to replace my DS Lite, and I'll explain why in a second. I plan to have both of them. I get the DSi mostly for DSiWare games. The original model DS was a little bit bigger than this, and it was a little bit chunkier, and the screens weren't as big. Well, here's the front of it, and if you can see, it has this kind of icon here, this embossed thing. This is a red one, by the way. It comes in a lot of different colors, and there's some special edition ones, like there's a Zelda one out there that's gold and has a Triforce engraved in it. There's like a Mega Man one. Well, whatever. Let's open it up. Actually, before I open it up, let's look at all the different sides. Here's the top of it. Now, here's slot 1. This is where DS games go. And you would just... Well, I'll show you the DS games later. You just pop them in there. And then there's these... Let me just turn that over there. I'm sorry. There's these two little holes. I actually don't know what the two little holes are there for. Okay, and there is the... what looks like a USB port. That's actually where the charger goes. Instead of using batteries, it has its own internal battery pack that you just put it on a charger, kind of like a cell phone. This side really doesn't have anything on it. And if you go to this side, this has the power, which is not like a switch, but kind of like a slider. And this also has where the stylus is kept. The stylus is, of course, used for the touchscreen controls. This is the DS Lite stylus, which is slightly longer than the original DS stylus. The DSi stylus is even longer. It's funny how the stylus started off as a little nub, and now it's almost the size of a pencil. Here's the back of it, where you can see where it says slot 1 there, and it says slot 2 there. That's where slot 2 is. I'll get to that in a second. This is the battery. It is removable, and you can change it if your battery ever dies on you. They do eventually wear out. And you could, of course, see the stylus there. All you have to do is just push it out. You don't have to keep the stylus in there, but it just makes sense. And here's the bottom. There's slot 2. That's where Game Boy Advance games go. If you're playing Guitar Hero, the Guitar Grip controller goes in there. There's the volume. And there's your headphone jacks. I think there's actually 2 different headphone jacks for 2 different interfaces, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, let's open it up. Oh, it's actually on. That red light indicates that it needs to be charged. Let me turn... Well, actually, let me just show you. Here's the top screen, and that's where you normally play Game Boy Advance games, unless you've specified otherwise. Here's the bottom screen, also called the touch screen. You always get this warning health and safety thing as you start, and then you press that. There's no games in it right now, but even without games, you got a clock, you got a calendar. It's telling me it needs to be charged there with that flashing light there. You could do the DS download play. You could link it up at the GameCube or the Wii. Actually, I think only the Wii, the Game Boy Advance linked up at the GameCube. You can go on PictoChat, and that's stuff without games. Now, normally what you do is to start your Game Boy Advance game, you'd click here or tap there, and to start your DS game, you'd start there. So let me just turn it off. I'm going to have to charge this later. So let's show you the media. Well, here's a typical Game Boy Advance game. That's Final Fantasy 1 and 2 Dawn of Souls. And it just goes right into slot 2 like this. Okay? They do stick out. Unfortunately, you can't put Game Boy Color or regular Game Boy games in there. They won't play. I mean, like I've said in my blog, if this thing were able to play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, I'd probably find a way to graft it onto my body. Now, the DSi is slightly thinner than this. They made it even thinner and lighter, and the screens are even bigger. And also, they gave it a matte finish so that it doesn't show fingerprints as well, that the finish is kind of like what it is here. So that's kind of interesting. Although I think that would make it a little slippery. Let me just take a DS card. Now I want to show you kind of the evolution of the sizes here. Here's a Game Boy game. You could see the size of it. And you could see that the Game Boy Advance game being about half the size of it. Here's a DS game. It's about a quarter the size of the original Game Boy game, half the size of a Game Boy Advance. And it's also very thin. Like you could see that even though these are about the same width, but then look at the DS game. They don't even call them cartridges, they call it cards, because, I mean, look at it, it's a card. This is Castlevania Order of Ecclesia. So we just pop that right into slot 1. And it's interesting, it actually goes all the way in, and you just pop it in and out like that. And I'll put a Game Boy Advance game, Final Fantasy, in there. And I'll just, since it has a little bit of a charge, I'll just show you, you know, how you would start them up. You could set this at any angle, which is pretty cool. See, and I could start Castlevania by tapping there, or I could start my Game Boy Advance game. And when you're playing a Game Boy Advance game, it only, of course, uses the top screen, or you could set it to use the bottom screen, but it doesn't matter. The only thing that's interesting is that you have to use the A and B buttons as A and B. You can't remap it to anything else. But you get used to it pretty quickly, and there's Final Fantasy starting up. Or, I can just turn it on. I don't feel like taking out the stylus. and play Castlevania. And since it's a DS game, it utilizes both screens. And I'm about out of time. I don't want this to be 2 videos, so let me just really quickly show you the PictoChat. And I'll take out the stylus. See, and you would go into these different chat rooms. There have to be people around you, and you could type things and hit send, or you can draw things and hit send. Like here, I can just draw a giant cock with balls shooting cum and just send that. Well, I erased it. But there you have it. That's flashing. It really needs to be charged. Sorry about that. I got to get that on the charger. But anyway, that's my look at the Nintendo DS. Join me in 2 weeks. We'll take a look at the Wii, Nintendo's latest and perhaps their greatest console. Well, you be the judge. We'll show it to you next week.